Okay, so the topic of Techeles nowadays doesn't relate to this coming week's parasha, but relates to the following week's parasha, so we get a head start. And it's a very important contemporary topic. I want to thank, first of all, Rabbi Tuvia Slager for loaning this pair of Techeles tzitzis as a very distinguished prapa for tonight's shir. Just full disclosure, I do not yet own one myself. But we'll see.
When's your birthday?
When's my birthday? Okay, it's good. During the summer. Okay, but thank you for asking. So when I was growing up, this topic was a quibble of my father, Zichron Levacha. He used to turn to me and say, why don't we wear Techeles? We're constantly mentioning this aspect of the mitzvah of tzitzis 2 times a day. Say Sulahem tzitzis ha'katevik dehem l'dorosam v'nasinu al tzitzis ha'kanaf ha'pisil Techeles, that they shall affix a thread of sky blue wool on the fringe of each corner. So here we are wearing tzitzis, but we're not attaching the pisil Techeles to our tzitzis. And so we all assume that, of course, the answer to the question was that the tradition of Techeles, of exactly how we find the Techeles, how we manufacture the Techeles, had gotten lost. Not that the mitzvah is no longer applicable, but that we're in the category of onus Rahman Patre on some level, that we simply don't have the means to perform this mitzvah, since we don't know what to do. And this is what the Medrash Rabbah in Parashas Shlach actually seems to indicate, that the Techeles was nignaz somehow, that it got stored away. That's what it says. It says, "Emasai kishu Techeles ta'akshav ein lanu elo loban she'Techeles nignaz." That's what the Medrash says. When was the Medrash Rabbah published? So Rabbi Chaim Twersky Shlita points out that the Medrash, different versions, different parts of the Medrash Rabbah were published different times. He estimates that this particular aspect of of the Medrash Rabbah was only published around the year 750 of the Common Era, and that the Techeles probably disappeared after the days of the Gemara, because the Gemara certainly talks about Techeles, how you make Techeles, people who are transporting Techeles, or Gemara in Sanhedrin, Daf Yud Beis. It probably disappeared between the years 570, what we call Common Era, and 750 Common Era, sometime during the period of the Geonim. Because you could see already it was even becoming a little less common. It was perilous to transport Techeles. It was something that the royal government wanted for itself. That's what you get out of the Gemara in Sanhedrin. You had to be very stealthy if you were transporting Techeles. But there have been efforts to renew the mitzvah of Techeles recently. Rabbi Gershon Chanoch Leiner, who was the Razina Rebbe, felt that in the late 1800s so, when he was living, that we need to make preparations for the Mashiach. And when we're going to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash, you can't have, as the Tosefta points out, you can't have Big Day Kahuna without one of its most important ingredients, which is Techeles. So how are we going to be able to do Avodah without the Techeles? So he looked at all the clues in the various Gemaras and Midrashim of what the Techeles is supposed to look like and to be like, and he set out on a quest to find the Techeles. And he thought that he had actually found it, that he found the right specimen, that the Gemara, after all, says it comes from Chilazon, and he thought that the Chilazon was some type of a squid fish called the cuttlefish. But pretty much everybody disagreed with him, although his Hasidim still make Techeles out of this substance, out of this fish, the cuttlefish, out of Yom Mized. There's a Techeles factory under the auspices of the Radzina Hasidim. But he felt that it does have certain extensions to it, tentacles that come around it that seem to be consonant with the descriptions of the Chilazon in certain midrashim, and he felt that he was able to achieve the right dye by working together with an Italian chemist at the time. But Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Halevi Herzog, who was the first Ashkenazic chief rabbi of the modern state of Israel, wrote his doctoral thesis on the question of Techeles in the early 1900s, I think 1913 to be exact, and he felt that the Razina Rebbe was fooled by this chemist who essentially used a Prussian blue which is a certain dye in the manufacture of what came out, like Techeles, what we understand to be some type of a blue wool, because the final product really only came from the Prussian blue dye and not from any real part of the fish. There was no real part of the fish that survived the process, so you could have made it from pretty much anything. It was really just the dye itself. So Rabbi Herzog himself thought that the chilazon was likely a snail, and he came up with the janthina snail, but that's not really a viable fabric dye, and also it kind of turns brown, and the Gemara says that Techeles is a sky blue, so that didn't really work out so well. He said that there was a different type of snail called the Murex trunculus, which he thought would be a good candidate, because it actually the snail comes from the region that the Gemara talks about, in the coast of the Mediterranean, coast off of the northern Israel near Lebanon, and the dye is fast. It does stick nicely to the garment, and it hides in the sand, like it says, "Spunei tzumune chol," in connection with the Techeles, and it also seems to have been regularly used as was discovered through archaeological digs for a dye, for royal blue dye and the like, royal purple dye, royal blue dye, and it also fits with the Rabbi's description of Techeles as relating to porpua, and porpua is, if you look at historical texts and the like, is essentially the word that was used for the Murex trunculus, and this was a very well-known snail that was used for dye purposes. However, he did not settle on the Murex trunculus, because the dye of the Murex trunculus discovered does not come out as a sky blue, but rather as a Tyrian purple. And even so, therefore, he gave up on it. However, but in the 1980s, it was discovered by those who were experimenting with the dye and the like, that it turns from that Tyrian purple to blue if you take it outside and you expose it to the sunlight, and voila, this is how we have contemporary Techeles. But is this correct? Are we all supposed to be wearing this tzitzis? You can see it comes out of, it's a very beautiful sky type of blue. It seems to be the right color. So if it's really correct, why did we not discover this for so many years? And why weren't all the Gedolim wearing it? Well, as far as the last question is concerned, some of the Gedolim, when it was discovered that you could actually create this type of dye of blue from the Murex trunculus by exposing it to the sunlight, did start to wear a Techeles, and that includes my own Rebbe Mufak, Rav Hershel Schachter Shlita, who wears the Techeles, and there were others as well, notably Rav Zalman Nechemya Goldberg Zatzal and Rabbi Yisrael Belsky Zatzal, and the list is apparently growing. We're not going to just do name dropping, but there certainly are very distinguished Rabbanim who really do seem to be wearing it. However,
so when we were in the desert, what did we use?
What did we use when we were in the desert?
Moses and Korah, what did they use?
I don't know, it's a good question. But let's go one step at a time, because right now we're far removed from the desert, and we have to figure out what we're going to use right now. So there are others, including Rav Asher Weiss and Rav Yisrael Reisman, who are strongly against it, and there are others like my Rebbe Rav Mordechai Willig, who are mildly against it, but not as strongly against it. And there are tshuvas that were published by Rav Yashiv Zatzal, Yivad L'chaim of Sternbach, who also gave various reasons not to wear the contemporary Techeles. In the materials, I have a long discussion by Rabbi Yitzchak Yosef and the Yalkut Yosef that he points out that the Chazon Ish and the Stipler didn't wear it, but of course, the Chazon Ish and the Stipler didn't have the more contemporary form of the Techeles. That was more a question of relying upon the Razina Rebbe's Techeles, which nobody really thought was Techeles, because the dye didn't really come from the cuttlefish altogether. So he himself just writes that it's not the minhag of the Eidos HaMizrach, of the Sfardim to do it. But at the same time, all of that is subject to change as we speak, because there are more and more Chachamim from all types of different camps who have begun to start wearing the Techeles. So I myself had 4 major rabbinic mentors in my life, amongst my many other wonderful rabbinic influences, and it ended up being a split decision, because I grew up in Monsey, and my shulvav was Rabbi Moshe David Tendler Zatzal, and he was staunchly in favor of this Techeles, thought this is the real thing, and very much supported the idea that we've actually found the real source of the Techeles. And of course, my Rebbe Mufak is Rav Hershel Schachter Shlita, and Rav Schachter also, as we mentioned, certainly feels that this is very likely the real Techeles, and you can't go wrong by wearing it. But on the other hand, I also have as my Rebbe Rav Mordechai Willett Shlita, who has written an article as to why he thinks that it is perilous to wear it, because if you get it wrong, we have too few Techeles strings or too many Techeles strings, you're going to violate Baal Tigro, Baal Tosif, because there's a three-way machlokus. How many Techeles strings? If you look at this, out of every 8 fringes that we have in the corners of the garment, so the opinion, this has 4. There are 4 Techeles strings and 4 whitest Lavan strings. That's the opinion of Rashi and Tosfos, that it's 4 and 4. But the opinion of the Rambam is that you only have 1 Techeles string, and the opinion of the Ravid is that you have 2 Techeles strings. So if you don't get it the right way, so you could be doing either too little or too much. Then there was, of course, my fourth major rabbinic mentor was, of course, none other than Rav Gedalia Dov Schwartz Zatzal, and Rav Schwartz, to the best of my knowledge, was not a Techeles wearer either, so it was kind of a 2 versus 2 split decision, and therefore I've been on the fence. However, Rabbi Belsky, who did wear... I'm sorry?
If it's machlokas, why is it Baal Tosef?
If it's a machlokas, because maybe you got it wrong. Like if one of these opinions is correct, and let's say you're only supposed to wear 1 Techeles string, and you end up wearing 4 Techeles strings, so it could be Baal Tosef if you're doing too much, right? Yeah, but that's the problem of machlokas, that maybe we'll get it wrong. You'll pick one side, and maybe you'll get it wrong. That's the concern Rabbi Wilk has. Rabbi Belsky said that a person should do his own research. So I've tried to look into the issue as best as possible. So the opening question might be, how do we wear tzitzis altogether without a critical component of the tzitzis? After all, the tzitzis is made up of the Lavan strings, and it's made up also of the Techeles strings. The Mishnah itself says explicitly, HaTecheles eino me'akeves es halavan, v'halavan eino me'akeves es Techeles. That one is not indispensable for the other. If you don't have Techeles strings, at least according to the opinion of the Chachamim, you can still wear the Lavan strings, and that's why we wear them nowadays. The Gemara does point out that this opinion in the Mishnah is only going according to the Chachamim. There is another opinion, and that's the opinion of Rebbe. Rebbe is of the opinion that the Techeles is. The Techeles and the Lavan are me'akib zeh zeh, that if you don't have the Techeles, then it seems, according to Rebbe, that you would not perform the mitzvah properly. Now, the Rambam, interestingly, accepts the opinion that they're not me'akib each other. That's the opinion and the ruling of the Rip, the Rambam, the Rosh, obviously the Shulchan Aruch. We all assume that way. But it's interesting because normally, when 2 things are not me'akib each other, the Rambam's of the opinion that they constitute like 2 separate mitzvahs. If I only have a tefillin shel yad or tefillin shel rosh, I should wear one of them because one is not me'akib the other. But the Rambam still lists them as 2 separate mitzvahs because they're not me'akib zeh zeh. If I have things that are me'akib, where I can't do one without the other, like the 4 minim that I shake on Sukkot, if I only have 3 out of the 4, so I'm not going to fulfill the mitzvah, so then the Rambam counts it as 1 mitzvah. But here, even though the Techeles and the Lavan are not indispensable for each other, the Rambam only counts it as 1 mitzvah. So this was a correspondence between Rabbi Daniel Ababli and the son of the Rambam, Rabbi Abam ben Rambam, as to why it is that the Rambam did this. It seems to be contradictory. And the answer that was given by the Rambam's son, is elucidated by the Netziv, and further elucidated by Rav Schachter, is essentially that it's true you can fulfill the mitzvah of the Lavan without the Techeles, but if all you have is the Techeles, so then that's a different story. Then it sort of falls into a different framework, which is that the whole purpose of the Techeles is to supplement the Lavan and to be something that you wind around the fringes of your garment. So when we say that the Lavan is not me'akev es Techeles, it means if I have to buy 2 viable Techeles strings and my Lavan strings got ripped a little bit, that's what we call gardumin, that the tzitzis are still going to be viable as long as the 2 strings that rip still are long enough to be kedei aniva, that I could still make a bow around them. But whatever the explanation, as we said, the vast majority of the poskim, the way that we paskin, is that certainly the Techeles is not me'akev the Lavan. There was one dissenting view, and that was the opinion of the Baal HaMaor. The Baal HaMaor said, well, I looked at the Gemara, the Gemara says that the Chachamim who disagreed with Rebbe was Rabbi Yitzchak. And Rabbi Yitzchak is one person, and the halach is Kerebi Mechavero. We pass on like Rebbe if he disagrees with one person, and therefore said the Baal HaMaor that we really don't have a mitzvah of tzitzis nowadays. What do you know? Because we don't have any Techeles. And the Ramban in the Milchamas Hashem, the source 5 over here says, I got to tell you a secret about the Baal HaMaor, that the Baal HaMaor actually Kol Yama Pater Atzma Min Tzitzis. Kidvav Alalu, he didn't wear tzitzis because he held that since we don't have Techeles nowadays, so it actually is mi'akev. There is another opinion that held.
Did he say it was like a bracha batala?
I guess so. Yeah, for sure. And there is another opinion that says we would hold like Rebbe, but only during the time period in which we actually still have techeles. That's the opinion of Rabbeinu Bachya al Chumash, who says that. But everybody else, as the Ramban points out, the Ramban says, "Orei avos kadmonim mimosa gaonim nagu latzeis b'talos sheish bo'lovim below techeles." He says that even if you look at the sugya, it's not Rebbe arguing with just Rabbi Yitzchak, it's Rabbi Yitzchak, Rabbi Nassim, Rabbi Yossi Aglili, Rabbi Yochanan Ben Nuri, that it's more than just one chacham, it's lots and lots of chachamim, and therefore he says that for sure the halacha is chachamim neged Rebbe, that the techeles is not me'akev, it's a lavan, so therefore we're yotze with the lavan alone. But as the Rambam pointed out, it could be that the techeles is still necessary as part of one mitzvah to enhance the mitzvah. So you can fulfill the mitzvah of the lavan without the techeles, but maybe it's not considered to be a full-fledged performance of the mitzvah. We would call a mitzvah b'shlei musa. In fact, there is a tradition that Rav Chaim Soloveitchik didn't wear his tzitzis on Shabbos in a Reshus Harabim area if there wasn't, a proper enclosure. Because of this concern that if it wasn't a mitzvah b'shlei musa, then maybe it would not allow one to wear it on Shabbos, that in order to wear it on Shabbos, it would have to be that you're wearing these fringes in a fashion in which you're fulfilling the mitzvah in the most complete sense of the mitzvah. And if you're not performing it b'shlei musa in the fullest sense that one can perform the mitzvah, then you shouldn't walk around with it on Shabbos. That's a very interesting suggestion, but it fits in with this idea that you can fulfill the mitzvah nowadays of tzitzis, but maybe it's not really, as we said, without the techeles, it's a lack of a full-fledged fulfillment of the mitzvah, even the mitzvah of the lovin itself. In fact, this plays a very important consideration in the approach of Rav Shechter, based on a pshuva by the Beis Halevi. The Beis Halevi it figures and factors very significantly in the discussion because of something that he says about the importance of Mesorah, but this is totally independent of what he has to say about Mesorah. If you look on page 9 of the material, source 26, Beis Halevi quotes from a Rashba and an interpretation of a Turi Eben, that when we talk about the violation about Tigra, that you're not allowed to have less than, when you perform a mitzvah, it can't be less than the amount that you're supposed to do. So normally we think, that means that I'm supposed to have 4 parashios in my tefillin. If I only had 3 parashios, that would be Bal Tigra. I'm supposed to have 2 parashios of Kriya Shema written in my mezuzah. If I only have 1 parashio, so that would be Bal Tigra. He says, no, that's not Bal Tigra. That's a lack of fulfillment of the mitzvah altogether. That's called Bittul mitzvah. You haven't fulfilled the mitzvah. I have 3 minim of my lulav. I have a lulav and an esrog and hadass, and I'm missing my aravos. I haven't fulfilled the mitzvah altogether. What Bal Tigra means is that I fulfill the mitzvah, but I do it in an inferior fashion. Like, for example, if I have chatas blood that I sprinkle on the mizbech, it's supposed to be sprinkled on all 4 corners of the mizbech, and I only sprinkled it on 1 corner, so I'm yosei the mitzvah, but as Rabbi Yeshua points out in the Gemara, I violated Bal Tigra. Sometimes I have no choice. I have chatas blood that gets mixed up with other blood. What are we going to do? So it's an efshar, so it's better, he says, to just only have 1 sprinkling than to have 4 sprinklings, and not to violate Bal Tosif, the kum v'aseh. This way it's more b'shei Bal Taseh. I do the bare minimum, but under those circumstances, I say, okay, I have to do the mitzvah, and the essay is doche lo saseh, under those circumstances. But if I don't have to be doche lo saseh, so then I shouldn't do so. So take a look at the Beis Halevi. He says, "Ve'ein lahakshos timkein mi sheyesh lo rak." This is the bold face of the Beis Halevi towards the end of the source on page 9. So you say, if that's what Baal Tikva means, that when you're performing the mitzvah in an inferior fashion, you're violating the Avera, why are we allowed to wear our tzitzis with just 11? Aren't we violating Lo Tigra, Baal Tigra, because of the fact that we're doing our mitzvah in a lesser than superlative fashion? It's not a complete fashion because we're missing the Techeles. So he says, no problem. He says the positive commandment of wearing the tzitzis, which was still Mekayim when we read 11, so that enables us to violate the Lo Saseh, the negative commandment of Baal Tigra, from the fact that we're not wearing the Techeles. But that's only when it's EF Shavakayim Shneim, when you're not able to keep both of the mitzvahs. So this relates very much to the Sugya on Daf Memam and Aleph in Maseches Menachos that talks about how people used to do something which was very pernicious. I'll give you sources in a second. If you take a look at source 7 on page 2, so it says that there was something very bad that people used to do. What is the arch enemy of Techeles? The arch enemy of Techeles is a very pernicious substance known as indigo. Okay, it's called Kala Ilan. Kala Ilan was a dye that they would spin onto wool, and that the merchants would pretend that it's a Techeles, and people who wanted to get away with spending much less money than the cost of regular Techeles from the fish that would spawn the Techeles, whatever it was, they would be able to pay a lot less if they would just get this indigo color. It would look like Techeles. So the Gemara says that Kadosh Baruch Hu is going to exact punishment, just like he exacted punishment from the Bechoros at Mitzrayim, the Bechoros of the Egyptians. Mimi shetola kaliyin mebigdav elmet Techeles. Somebody who places this dye of kaliyin, which is not the real bona fide Techeles, and he pretends that it's Techeles. Now, one of the reasons that this is very bad is because of the fact that we know that the Torah tells us we have a juxtaposition. That you're not allowed to wear shatnez, wool and linen together, but rather you are supposed to put tzitzis in your garments. So we derive from here that if you're wearing tzitzis, so even if you're wearing a linen garment, it's okay to have the wool of the tzitzis in your garment, because you can only have, when it comes to Techeles has to be wool, and therefore to fulfill the mitzvah of tzitzis, so then you can override the Lo Saseh of shatnez. But that's only because of the fact that you need to wear Techeles. But if you take a look at source 9, the Gemara Menachos and Daf Mem and Aleph says that according to Beis Shammai, you should not put sud in tzitzis. You should not wear a linen garment for your tzitzis, because even though Beis Hillel disagrees, and basically would paskin like Beis Hillel officially, but the Gemara points out that in Yerushalayim they really didn't do this, and the reason they really prohibited having this type of garment, why would they prohibit it when the Torah indicates that you're allowed to have the woolen Techeles in your linen tzitzis? So the answer is because they would make a gezerah. If you look in the fourth line, the people would put kala ilan. They would put wool that was not Techeles. They would not fulfill the mitzvah of Techeles, and therefore they would violate the avera of kilayim. So the Gemara says, why is it a violation of kilayim? They still fulfill the mitzvah of tzitzis, because you know what? Even if you put Techeles, it's not real Techeles. It turns out that you got the wrong fish. It turns out that it's really just kala ilan. It turns out that it's really just indigo, right? So it's not really Techeles, so it still counts as no worse than lavan. That the same way you have these white strings, so you have strings that are colored with something else, but the same way Techeles ain't a makeres as a lavan ain't a makeres as a lavan. Lavan doesn't have to be white, it could be any color, and that's also going to be perfectly fine, at least a pity yevet. So the Gemara says, no, came into Efsha b'minan lo. Once I'm using something which is not actual Techeles, I don't need to have wool. So therefore, these people who are putting wool that is not actual Techeles on a linen garment, so that's something which is an avera. Like Reish Lakish says, if I have a positive commandment and a negative commandment, if you can fulfill them both without violating one, mutav, that's what you should do. And only if you can't be mekayim shneim, only if you can't fulfill both the lav, the essay, and the lav, yavo essay v'yitches lo saseh, do we say if the positive commandment is able to override the negative commandment? Here, there's absolutely no reason to take kala ilan wool and to put it on a linen garment. If you would have techeles, so then that would make sense because you're fulfilling the mitzvah. But not if you're not going to put actual techeles on it. So what we see from here is that in the event that you do not need to override a negative commandment, then you have no right to say Yavo Esi Vitkas Losa say. So what did the Beis Halevi say? He said nowadays we have no choice. We have to fulfill. We have to violate about Tigra of not fulfilling the mitzvah in the fullest possible sense because we don't have Techeles, so therefore we have no choice. But if you actually did have Techeles and you still insist on only wearing 8 Lavan strings in every single corner of your garment, so then you are violating the Losase, the negative commandment about Tigra, when you don't really have to. So that's basically the argument that Rav Shechter makes. He says that since nowadays there's a strong argument that this Murex trunculus is really the chilaz and really the snail, the type of fish or snail that is described. We'll see, the Gemara describes it as a dag, as a fish, but many of the commentators point out that dag is like an all-encompassing term, and it can also include a snail as well. So since we very well may have identified the source of Techeles, then this, what I'm touching right now, might actually be Techeles, so therefore, says about the Rav Shechter, we have a principle of suffix to Reiss or the Chumrah, even if it's only a suffix. Maybe you have an argument to say it's not really Techeles, but since it's a good argument to say that it is Techeles, so therefore you should do the mitzvah. And not only that, he says, you don't have to wear tzitzis altogether. We wear it to show our great love for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Look, that we're going out and we're buying a 4-cornered garment in order to put these tzitzis strings in it to show our great love for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But really, you're not obligated to put these strings in your garments if you're not wearing a 4-cornered garment in the first place. So says Rosh Shechter something very, very strong, very powerful. I don't know that you'd have to be Rosh Shechter, obviously, to make such a compelling, such a strong statement. He says it's better not to wear tzitzis altogether than to just wear tzitzis that are white nowadays without the techeles, because you're violating a losas bal tikra when you really don't have to, and therefore there's no justification for it because you could put in the techeles strings. Look at the bottom of page 9, source 27. Somebody who can place this techeles in their tzitzis garment in the yontu. So, would have been better for this person not to wear a tzitzis garment altogether. Because if he doesn't put on a 4-cornered garment, he's not obligated in the mitzvah altogether. But if you actually wear the garment, and you do it in an inferior fashion of only wearing the Lavan strings without the Techeles strings, when you really could arguably put on the Techeles strings, at least as a suffix at the very least, Haresa Ovid about Tigra, then this person is violating Baal Tigra. Rabbi Willig doesn't seem to be so excited about this. He said, if you're not going to wear tzitzis altogether, so then that's being mizazel in the mitzvah of tzitzis. He feels that would really degrade the mitzvah if you don't go out and you don't get yourself an Abra Kanfo, so he feels that the natural state of being, it's like I wake up and I have like my body on me. So my natural state of a Jew's being is that I wake up and I put on tzitzis. It's not considered like I'm actually doing something affirmative, which it might be considered to be an avera. That's like your natural state. That's considered to be shebe al taseh. If then I decide to put on techeles, so that's a kum ve'aseh, and I have to figure out whether then maybe I might be getting myself into dangerous territory by putting on too few techeles strings or too many techeles strings, who will be pal tigla, pal tosef, so he doesn't necessarily feel so sanguine about that. But Rosh Hashanah says, no, look at the strict halacha. Strict halacha is that one doesn't have to put on tzitzis. This is only if you wear a beged of dal kanfos. So why do so if you're going to violate the avera about tigla? It's one thing when we didn't have techeles, but nowadays, it's a very strong argument that we do have techeles. But who says it's the real techeles? Presumably, Rosh Shechter Shlita wouldn't have made this argument with respect to prior to the 1980s, when this great discovery was made that Rav Herzog was right after all in terms of his Havamina, that the Muriax trunculus really seems to be the real chilazon. And what do you know, when you hold the dye out to sunlight, it actually turns blue, and it's not just this Tyrian purple. So why didn't we say, with respect to the Razina, the Rebbe's Techeles said, maybe we should wear that because it's a suffix. So presumably the answer is that everybody knew, of course, it's not even a suffix, because that doesn't seem to fit, the simanim of the Gemara at all in terms of what a chilazon is supposed to look like. And it only turned blue because of the fact that it had this Prussian blue dye that basically didn't rely upon the fish altogether. So who says that we have more simanim in this particular case? So Shekta points out that there seem to be more simanim because the Gemara talks about being potzea, like you're breaking the shell of the chilazon in order to get out the dye, and this snail, unlike the cuttlefish, it has a nice hard shell that you need to break in order to be able to extract the dye. The dye actually does end up being blue. It actually is found in the exact region where the Gemara says that you would find the chilazon, and it also, according to archaeological findings, is the chief type of snail that was used by all of the royal courts to produce their very fine purplish and bluish garments. So, and we also have Rishonim that explicitly identify the chilazon with this purpura, which is like the Rabia that we know based on all of our linguistic evidence is a reference specifically to the Murex trunculus. But at the same time, as we'll see, there are Gemaras that it doesn't seem to coincide with. The Gemara says that the chilazon comes up once every 70 years. The Gemara says that it climbs up mountains on occasion, and if it would climb up the mountains, the chilazon wouldn't last. It can't last for a couple of hours outside of the water. So there are things that it says that the color of the skin of the fish is this color of blue, is the color of the yam, of the sea, and really it has a colorless type of skin. It doesn't have a bluish skin itself. The dye that comes out can eventually turn blue. So there, and on many occasions the Gemara refers to it as a dag, and you could say maybe a snail is not exactly the same thing as a dag. So it's not like every single reference to chilazon from which the Techeles was produced jives 100% perfectly with the Murex trunculus. So Rav Shakta says you're right. You have a suffix. You have some evidence that's very strong, some evidence that there's some evidence that's less strong, but we have the principle of suffix derais to the chumrah. So Avasha Weiss and others quote from the Pri Megadim in connection with an esoteric discussion regarding zimun, people who might only know how to say one bracha, not all the brachos, when do you do a zimun, and so forth. So he quotes from the Pri Megadim who says that a suffix derais to the chumrah only applies when you know that when you perform the mitzvah, you will definitely perform the mitzvah. But otherwise, like, I'm not sure if I bench. So if I bench again, I know I'll definitely perform the mitzvah of benching. I'm not sure if I shook a kosher lulav. I'm going to take a kosher lulav, I'm going to shake it, so I know that I definitely perform the mitzvah. But even after doing it, if you don't know you're going to perform the mitzvah, you will have performed the mitzvah. We don't say suffix derais to the chumrah. So Shekta points out, there was a discussion about this very point between Rabbi Menachem Zemba, who was killed by the Nazis, and his son. When his son died, so Rabbi Menachem Zemba published a Sefer Gor Aryeh Yehuda in memory of his son that published the correspondences, and they discussed this issue. And one of the things that emerged from the discussions is that if there's a Ran in Masechah Sukkah on the Gemara Daf Mem Vav Amud Beis, it seems to say explicitly that, let's say I have a lulav and it's a bein hashmashos after the first day. So if I shake it now, I didn't perform the mitzvah yet, but if I shake it now during bein hashmashos, it might be too late. Maybe I won't perform the mitzvah. So do I do it anyway? It says yes. If it's a derabbanan, the other days of Sukkot you don't do it, but if it's the first day of Sukkot, when it's a daraisa, so then you do it. So he seems to clearly not hold this way. And this is Savara. It seems to be the one that Rav Shekta relies upon to say that even if you are not going to definitely fulfill the mitzvah, we still would apply the principle of suffix derais to chumrah, especially if when I don't avail myself of the suffix, I'm definitely going to violate an avera of Baal Tigra. So that makes it a little bit stronger. This svara, however, of the Pri Megadim is something that's also quoted. I don't know if it's in writing, but it's quoted in the name of Rav Chaim Soloveitchik as well. Rav Chaim Soloveitchik also said that suffix derais l'chumrah only applies if when you are going to do the mitzvah out of a suffix, you definitely will perform the mitzvah. So that's one critique with respect to this particular approach. However, I have to tell you that very much at the heart of the dispute is, what do you need in order for something to even be a suffix? As we said, the Razina Rebbe's Techeles is not considered to be even a suffix, according to many. So Rav Sternbach points out in his tshuvos to a different comment of the Beis Halevi. I think Rav Yashiv does as well. This is a famous Beis Halevi, not the one that I quoted about Baal Tigra, but a Beis HaLevi that doesn't appear anywhere in the Beis HaLevi. But it does appear in the Razina Rebbe's work, Tmunei Chol, where he talks about his discovery. He wrote 3 books, 3 Sfarim, discussing his discovery of what he thought that was the Techeles, the cuttlefish. He was very excited about it, and he elicited the responses of a bunch from all over Europe, and he got responses where everybody saying, "No way, Razina Rebbe, we love you, and you're big time a chacham," which he was, and we love your Torah, but the cuttlefish, it just ain't it. It doesn't cut it. So the Beis HaLevi was one of the people who responded, but he didn't respond himself. There was a friend, acquaintance, reliable purveyor of the Beis HaLevi's opinion, who wrote a letter to the Razina Rebbe saying, "This is what the Beis HaLevi thinks." The Beis HaLevi says, "You don't have a mesola. You need a mesola for the chilazon, for this fish from which the Techeles is extracted. Since we have lost the mesorah, therefore you can't come up with a cuttlefish." The thing is that there are 2 different versions of what the Beis HaLevi actually said. There is the version that appears in the Razina Rebbe's book, which would seem to be the more reliable version, and that version says that what you have over here, Razina Rebbe, is a negative mesorah. You have a negative mesorah, that it can't be the cuttlefish, because the Rabbanim and Gedolim from of course, through all the centuries, up until the modern day, they know about the cuttlefish. It's like you say that the jippy, the guppy or the catfish that's swimming around your tank is the chilazon. Like everybody knew about this thing, and nonetheless they never entertained the idea that this is really the chilazon from which you manufacture the techeles. And had this really been the one, so then they would have been able to identify it beforehand. So that's sort of the version that Rav Elyashiv quotes in his tshuva when he talks about not relying upon the tradition of the Razina Rebbe and not relying upon this newfangled Techeles either. He says that there was a negative tradition, but if you could conclusively prove that there was some sort of a fish or some snail or some creature that was not known to all the people who were living wherever they were living for hundreds and hundreds, over 1,000 years, and only now they're sort of rediscovering a particular fish or snail and discovering that there's a dying process they didn't know about with respect to this snail, and you can prove that this really is the Techeles. So then he said, I'll be the first one to jump on the bandwagon and to wear that Techeles. That's what the Beis HaLevi really seemed to say. But the tradition in the Soloveitchik family, and one that even Rav Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik accepted, certainly the Brisker Rav accepted this tradition, was a totally different tradition, which is that we learn from the pasuk Shal Avicha v'yageitcha zikeinecha v'yom mulach. Shal Avicha v'yageitcha teaches me that those things that I definitely need a Kabbalah to know whether it is good or not, like, for example, a kosher bird. So there, for sure, you need a mesorah. But even zikeinecha v'yom mulach, even if it is something where you could conceivably prove without beyond the shadow of the doubt, through archaeological proofs, through linguistic proofs, historical proofs, and so forth, that this is really the thing. Nonetheless, it's not sufficient to say, I can't use something because it has a negative mesorah, but I need a positive mesorah. I need a positive mesorah throughout all the ages, even if it's 100% clear that this murex trunculus is really the chilazon. If I lost that mesorah over time, we have to wait for Mashiach. We have to wait for Mashiach to come in order to be able to restore the mesorah. What?
When you say positive mesorah, what's a positive mesorah?
A positive mesorah is that I need to have an affirmative knowledge that something was passed down from generation to generation, that this was definitely the chilazon. If it wasn't affirmatively, positively passed down from generation to generation that this was the chilazon, it doesn't matter, says the Brisker Rav. Even if you think that you can prove it, nonetheless, it is not going to be good. It's not going to be reliable, because the Torah requires a mesorah from generation to generation. And in fact, they point to the pasuk. This is an interesting drush in the pasuk, but in the Parsha Tzitzis it says, when it comes to just the regular mitzvah of the tzitzis, like my white strings, okay, that's going to be the dorosam. But when it says v'nasnu al tzitzis hakanat b'sil techeles, says I'm going to put a b'sil techeles, doesn't say the dorosam. Apparently, that's something which it was not guaranteed to last throughout the generations, that the mesorah might get cut off at some point in time. However,
that's his proof.
That's one of the drushes that they quote for this. You'll find that in. I think they attribute that to the Brisker Rav. But so Schechter notes the Reiss against this approach are very strong, because you have the story in Baba Basra and Parakamoker Sasfina of Rabbi Baba Chana, who was walking in the desert and he came across the Meisei Midbar, and when he came back to his base medrash, they asked him, do you count the number of strings? Because there was a machlok in that tzitzis. There was a machlokis between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. They certainly wore tzitzis in the midbar, at least in terms of the number of strings. That much they had, Jack. But in terms of the number, Beis Shammai held that you have 8 strings, like we hold. This is one of the 6 cases where we hold like Beis Shammai against Beis Hillel. And Beis Hillel held that there were only 6 strings. So they said, did you count the number of strings? And he said, no, I didn't. And they called him all kinds of bad names because of the fact that he didn't do that. And they said that, you really, because had he checked it, they could have established the halacha based on that archaeological evidence. So we do see that we follow archaeological evidence when it comes to these matters. But you still need the underpin, even if you assume that way, you still have to get to the question of what is the bare minimum that I need for the underpinnings of a suffix. So when Rabbi Yisrael Reisman gave a shiur on this subject, and he is very strong, you should know, to say that he's pretty much 100% sure, close to it, that this murex trunculus can't be the chilazim. He said, if I was 50%, if there was a 50% suffix, I would tell you that you must wear it. If it was a 10% suffix, I would tell you that it's a good idea to wear it. But he says this is so much less than even 10%. And even Rav Asher Weiss, in the second chelik of the Shilos Shuvos Minchas Asher, he says that all of the proofs are very tenuous, and to the extent that they're based upon archaeological findings, historical findings, and the like, he says, those are hasharos bi'alma. Those are just general conjectures that are made that are not really Torah sources, and therefore he's not so comfortable with that. It says porpura, and porpura we know is the murex trunculus. Maybe they meant something else by porpura. But Rabbi Lamb demonstrated that with what did the merchants used to pretend? They would pretend that the indigo, that the color elon was the Techeles. So obviously one was very similar to the other, and Rabbi Lamb showed that the chemical composition of indigo is identical to the Techeles which gets extracted from the chilazim. So they said, so to that, Rav Asher Weiss would say, well, who says that when they said indigo, it means the same thing we mean by indigo? So some of his reputations are not all that compelling. But what do we actually have to prove the point? So one Gemara, really, what Rabbi Reisman concedes. He concedes it's the best Gemara for the case of murex trunculus, is the case of the Gemara in Shabbos that talks about exactly the region from which you're able to obtain chilazim, where it says that the region is mi sulamo shel tzur ad Haifa. That it's the area which is sort of in this northern Israel, which is on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, and that is exactly where you find the chilazon nowadays. And that's, if you look at source 17, when Nebuzaradan exiled the Jewish people, he left behind the Tzayadei Chilazon, the trappers of Chilazon, Misulama Shel Tzur V'Yad Haifa, because they were the ones who knew how to trap Chilazon. That was very important for the royal court, because that's from that they would make the royal garments. So he said, that's pretty good. That's, the area of Old Tyre, that's pretty good. But he says, you don't know from there that it's a murex trunculus. It could be like some other type of a creature that happened to be in that area. Now, the Rambam says 3 things about this fish, which is the chilazon. And what the Rambam says ends up being a little bit problematic, because the Rambam says that V'hu this is the 3rd line in source 12 on page 3, V'hu it's a fish, Shedoma Ein Aleina Techeles V'Damo Shachar. He says it has black blood. We don't find that this chilazon has black blood per se, but then again, we don't even make the Techeles from the blood, we make it from the mucus, we make it from a secretion, but okay, might have 2 types of blood. And he says it's in the Yam HaMelech, it's in the Salt Sea, which is not the Mediterranean Sea. But some say that the Rambam sometimes refers to the Mediterranean Sea as the Yam HaMelech, so that's not so problematic. But the fact that the Rambam calls it a dag, he calls it a fish, so Rabbi Reisman says, well, this isn't a fish, this is a snail. However, on the other hand, if you take a look at Rashi in source 15, Rashi identifies the chilazoni as nimin balaz, a min chilazon, which seems to be a reference to a snail type of creature based on the old French word that he uses. So we see that maybe fish can be just something, as Rabbi Tversky says, something that spawns eggs. It doesn't have to be necessarily something that we call a fish. It could be a sea creature of some sort, and therefore that fits this description. Some say that it's a dag in its shape because it's like narrow at the top and the bottom and wide in the middle, and there are different ways in which you can justify the description of it as a dag, even according to the Rambam. Furthermore, there is, as I mentioned, the Rabbiya, who equates chilazon with porphyrin, which we know from old texts of dictionaries and the like, certainly is identified with the murex trunculus. The other raya is the color. The Gemara says explicitly that the color of the chilazon is the color of the sea. If you take a look at source, hold on, this is the Gemara on Daf Mem Gimel, source 19, says Tanya Haya Rabbi Meir Omer Manishtana Techeles Mikol Minei Tzivonim. In what way is Techeles different from other colors? Techeles Doma Liyam, famous Gemara. Everyone who knows anything about Techeles knows that this Gemara, Techeles is like the color of the sea, and the sea is like the sky, and the sky is like the Kisei HaKavod. And therefore it reminds us of the Kisei HaKavod in our devotion and connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So this is why it was so important to Rav Herzog that he said, it's purple, so that's not going to work. But when it turned out to be blue, so that works out very, very well. And also, especially once we discovered that we can understand why we get mixed up with the color Elon, because it's the same chemical composition. But wait a second, Rabbi Reiss said, you just disproved your point without even realizing it. You see, you thought that you proved yourself, but you checkmated yourself. Because the Gemara says that if you want to tell if somebody's really fooling you with kala elon, so then you use like a certain type of a chemical solution in order to wash away the dye once it's on the cloth, and you'll be able to tell the difference because the kala elon will be washed away. You'll be able to remove the color from the cloth, while if it's really techeles, it's going to stick. It's going to hold fast. And therefore, he says that if indeed the chemical composition would be 100% identical, so you wouldn't have this difference with respect to the test between the two. So that actually does seem to be a pretty good kasha, but the answer is that the kasha isn't as strong as the proof, because the proof really shows that there was this tremendous resemblance between the kala elon and what we consider to be the techeles. That's why one would be mistook with the other. And in fact, given that powerful connection, you figure that since the murex trunculus was around in that point in time, if the murex trunculus wasn't the techeles, Chazal would have said, in addition to watch out for kala elon, they would have said, watch out for murex trunculus. The fact they didn't say that indicates that really was the techeles. And maybe there were traces of other things, as Dr. Baruch Sturman, who's one of the big mumchim when it comes to this, says there were traces of other things that would come together with the kala elon or the techeles that would, or certainly the kala elon, that would enable that dye to be removed, and it wasn't from the actual chemical composition that the difference would be discerned. In any event, we don't really know how to conduct this particular test nowadays. So the color here seems to be also a very strong indication. Tosefta indicates there's really only one chilazon from which one creature from which you can get techeles. So it really seems to be supportive as well of this finding that it's really techeles. But what about the idea that the Gemara says in Sanhedrin that every so often you will have this infusion of these chilzonim that are going to ascend mountains? So some quote the Yad Mamo says that there were chilzonim and there were chilzonim. That every time that the Gemara talks about a chilazon, it's talking about a chilazon from which a techeles was extracted. That could have been talking about a different chilazon. So Rashi in Gemara Megillah and Dapav, which seems to indicate that the chilazon that would go up the mountain was in fact the same chilazon from which the techeles would be extracted. But okay, so you have different kashas, but it doesn't necessarily mean because you have one kasha that defeats all of the different sources. Maybe there were different types of different chilzonim that were at least in the same family as the chilazon from which you would extract the techeles, and that's why they were drawing the comparison. But one other strong kasha that Rabbi Reisman brings is that the Gemara in Shabbos on Daf Ayin Hey talks about the tzidei chilazon, talks about those who would trap the chilazon, and it says, and they would trap the chilazon, as Rashi says, l'tzvoa techeles b'yado, in order to be able to make the dye of techeles. All that is fine, but they would trap them. They would trap them, and it says that they would be kosher or matir. That's how we learn the malachos of tying and untying in the Mishkan, and all the rishtos, all of the nets would have to be made in a way in which they would have to be tied and untied. And the kasha is, number one, that if you're dealing with a snail, which is just crawling on the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea, on the riverbed, so you don't have to use a net in order to have it crawl inside. You would typically just use a box or a basket to have it crawl inside and not a net. So that's kasha number one. And kasha number two is that the Gemara on the very next page, on Daf Ayin Hey, says that Hatzar Chilazon is going to be chayav at the very least. If you trap a Chilazon, you're going to be chayav, you might be chayav for breaking its shell, which might be dash, but you're also going to be chayav for tzad. At the very least, you're going to be chayav for tzad. You're going to be chayav for trapping. So says Rabbi Reisman, you know what we're dealing with when we're talking about a snail? We're talking about a creature that's going to be walking as slowly as a snail, right? And therefore, it's not subject to the malach of tzeda, because to be subject to the malach of tzeda, you have to be able to, it has to be something which you wouldn't be able to scoop up in one lunge. If you scoop it up in one lunge and you don't have to run after it with several lunges, so then it's not subject to tzeda. So how can you say that this is going to be subject to tzeda? So he has all of this as a very strong kashas. And besides, we also have the Gemara in Megillah that I quoted earlier that indicates that the place that the tribe that would go out and we get the Chilazon was the tribe of Zevulun, and everyone assumes that it's because it's Achop Yamim Yishkon, because Zevulun is right next to the water. But if you learn Sefer Yoshua, you'll see they were actually landlocked. They weren't right next to the water. Maybe they had a thin strip that went into the water, but they weren't really right next to the water. So then, what was the great mile of Zevulun, that they're the ones who are going to be getting the Techeles, according to the Gemara? So it must be that when we talk about that, it's because they were sailors. And since they were sailors, so they would be the ones that caught Srikan Lachai de Chilazon, that would go out to the deep seas and they would trap the Chilazon. But the Chilazon are these Murex trunculus snails. You don't have to go out to the deep seas. You can just go right off the shores and pick it up. So these are some of the kashas that Rabbi Reisman had. Rabbi Ari Leibowitz had a good answer for the various kashas. He points out that, number one, there is evidence from the writings of Pliny the Elder from the 1st century that they did use nets, actually, in order to, right, they actually did use nets in order to trap the chilazon fish, because even if they would just have them march into the nets, it was just much easier to scoop them up with the nets. And number two, you really do have to trap them, because it's one thing if they're walking on the shore and you're just scooping them up with your hands, but if they're on if they're on the floor of the river, so they can slither away much more easily because they have all of this water and they have it there, and they're able to hide away much more easily inside of the water. And therefore, even if it's a snail-type creature, it can more easily escape from you inside of the water. And of course, you need to do tzeda. And there probably would be a much greater concentration of these snails the further out you get from the water. So you would have to send sailors on an expedition in order to be able to trap them. So none of these are really the same bomb kashas that you would have thought that they would be. Yes, question.
How would they go down all the way when they didn't have?
It's not easy.
It wasn't so far down. But they knew how to go down. They can dive down certainly far enough in order to get to where the snails, where the Murex trunculus snails would be. You would still have to go out a considerable distance. Now it says that, and also they could lower the nets. And when you lower the nets, you don't have to actually be there on the bottom of the sea. You could just lower the nets, and then they could go into the nets. Now, some say, also the fact that it says posea, that they would break the shells, is also a good indication that, at least some say, it's a raya in favor of the chilazon being the Murex trunculus as well. And the Gemara, though, does say that it's better to be able to extract the dam, or the dye from the chilazon during the lifetime, when the chilazon is still around. when it's still alive. So that's a little bit of a question, because the way in which they extract, if you take a look at source 16, at the Daf Ayin Hey Amud Aleph, it says the Kama the Ispein Neshama. It's the last line. That you're going to have a better dye if it is still alive, and the way in which they extract the dye nowadays is only when it has already died. And there is no indication you're going to get a better dye when the chilazon is still alive. So that the various poskim who talk about that nowadays, or the various writers, including our own Rabbi Tversky, he says that the truth of the matter is that it doesn't really prove the point, because the way in which the dye is extracted has to be almost immediately after the chilazon has died. So it's essentially, when we say kama de ispei neshama, tfei nichole, it means the closer to when the chilazon is alive, the better the dye is going to be, because if you wait too long, even an hour or so after the chilazon has died to extract the dye, it's not going to be as good. So therefore that's not a kasha either. And the fact that it's referred to as something which is funei tzmunei chol, that it's in the sand, that these are creatures that are in the sand. These snails do in fact hang out in the sand, and there's also a medrash that says that they have a shell that grows with them, and obviously that's something which makes more sense when you're talking about a snail-type creature like the Murex trunculus, and if you would be talking about an actual fish, like a squid-type creature like the cuttlefish, so therefore that works out well too. So Rav Asher Weiss simply comes to the conclusion that, well, you have to explain away so many of these Gemaras. Oh, it's really, there really can be tzeda. We can, shit is 70 years doesn't mean that, it just means they're not so easy to find. Doesn't mean that they climb up every 70 years. The mountains doesn't mean that this type of chilazon goes into the mountain. He says that a dog doesn't really mean a dog. When the Rambam says that the blood is black, okay, so maybe that's not based on any Gemara, so we don't have to follow it. He says there are so many, and the color where the Gemara says is doma liyam, so you say, well, it just means there's a lot of algae that gathers on it, what's in the sea, so it looks like it's doma liyam. He says that you have to rationalize and explain away so many kashas that it's as if you are assuming that there's a bas call, some heavenly voice that went out and said, oh, it has to be the Murex trunculus, so therefore you're going to answer every single kasha. He says, I don't have to, I'm not bound by that. I didn't hear the bas call, says Rav Asher Weiss. So therefore, in my opinion, it doesn't even approach the realm of Suffolk altogether. And Rabbi Reisman is bothered by the indigo problem, that if it's really the same chemical composition, so why would one stick fast and the other not stick fast? And he's bothered by the Seder problem, is there really trapping in such a snail? And the fact that since he's a big expert in Tanakh, he gives the shiurim on Tanakh all the time, he says, so he knows exactly where the tribe of Zebulun hang out, and it wasn't right by the Mediterranean shore, so he's bothered by that as well. So at the end, and he's not impressed by the archaeological evidence. But I said all of these different kashas are certainly something to take into account. But we also brought many decent rayas as well. So at the end of the day, if you're asking me my opinion, it seems to me like you actually do have like a reasonable suffix, particularly with all of the shells that were discovered in ancient Phoenician civilization for the royal garments and the like, which we know are often described as having been made from Techeles, and we know that they were made with these Murex trunculus shells that we're finding. And since we do take archaeology seriously, then it is something that I think we can assume does at least enter the realm of Suffolk, and then we have to consider, is it something that we should do? If it is at the very least a suffix. Some say, well, don't do it because it's like Mexican Euro, because you're going to look like you're arrogant if you do it. But the truth is, Rav Yitzchak Yosef, after bringing all of the arguments about Masorah, he brings that argument and says, it's not really Mexican Euro. If you're doing it like for purposes of fulfilling a mitzvah, you don't have to worry about that. Rav Shachar says that as well. Rav Steinbach throws in, what about Lo Siskodedu? That you'll have different factions of people doing different things. So many say, we have different factions of people doing like everything different nowadays. Because some people take different nuschos for Kaddish when they get up, and people wearing tefillin or not wearing tefillin to call a boy, and especially, you don't have to worry about Moses Godu. Rav Shachar says, let's say nobody happens to shake a lulav in your shul, you're the only one who's Mekayim Dal Minim. So are you violating Lo Siskodedu if you're the only one who fulfills the mitzvah? He says, it's not Lo Siskodedu if you're looking to fulfill a mitzvah. But what about the shitos, the different shitos as to whether it should be 1 string, 2 strings, or 4 strings? So Rav Shachar says, if you look in the Shulchan Aruch, that shaila is really, he thinks it's been paskin. Because since we assume when it comes to like the Gardumin, like the Rambam says, that you separate out into two different sets of two strings, as long as you can keep track of which string is doubled over, and you know you have the right one that's doubled over, and then you see that there are only two strings that were cut on this side, so you know that you're good, as long, even if there's like a third string, and you know that it's coming from those same two strings, and the other side is completely intact, so then you would be able to still wear your tzitzis as long as you had kedei aniva, enough to make a bow in the section that got cut. So the fact that we do separate between the two sets of two strings seems to indicate that we do hold like Rashi and Tosos. Now, Rabbi Willig did his research, and according to his research, there are many more people who follow either the opinion of the Ravid or the Rambam in terms of the number of strings. So not everyone necessarily goes along with that of Rav Shechter, which is why Rabbi Willig says, well, if you're not going to go along, so then you have a double problem. If it turns out that it's not really Techeles, so that he quotes Rav Sternbach based on the Tosos, who says that if you have in mind to fulfill Techeles, and you don't fulfill Techeles, you violate Baal Tosif, so you have to make sure to have Kavanah. If this isn't really Techeles, it should count as a white string. You have to have that Kavanah. I'm sorry, you have to make a Tanai, right? Like people do when they put on Trilin on Cholam, you have to make like some sort of a Tanai. But then he says if it really is Techeles, and let's say that you have the wrong number, like you have one or two, and you're really supposed to have four, so then you haven't fulfilled the Techeles because you had too few Techeles. There's even an argument to say that in such a case, if you didn't fulfill Techeles, that you must have the 8 strings of Lavan, and you didn't have the 8 strings of Lavan either, so then you're in trouble on both directions. But I don't know, I'm not, so he says it only really works if you're 100% sure that Rav Shechter is right, that it's supposed to be 4 strings. But I think if you have 4 strings of Techeles, probably you are okay, because then you probably have for sure fulfilled Techeles, because you have, if you're supposed to have 1, you have at least 1. If you're supposed to have 2, you have at least 2. And if you have more than is necessary, it could be that for sure that you are Yotzei, you could be Yotzei the Techeles and the Lavan. I'm not sure if everybody would agree with that, but I think that there's an argument to be made along those lines. So then the question is, what's the harm? If it turns out it's not really Techeles, you still fulfill the mitzvah of Lavan. Some say, well, we have this chumrah based on the Shita Samachab, and the Mishnah Berurah says we should be machmir for that the color of the garment should always be the same as the color of the tzitzis, but that's a lechatzchila. It's not miyakev, the Ramah says not miyakev. So therefore, fulfilling a mitzvah deraisa would certainly supersede the concern regarding that minhag. Some say, well, you're evoking the sitra achra, like, they are really like spooky stuff. If you're wearing something that you think is techeles, it's not techeles because it's like the color elan issue. But the color elan issue was mostly a concern that you're going to violate kalayim by putting wool on a linen garment, and therefore that really should not be that should not be so pertinent. Therefore, it seems that there is a lot of merit, shall we say, to the positions that are in favor of wearing techeles. There's a little bit of a question: how do you wind the various wrappings around the different links and the different wrappings? Do you have 7 links, or do you have 5 links 4 links the way we have in our talis? There's a sheet of Tosos that really you should have 7, especially when you're dealing with the Techeles, since the main mitzvah wrapping is with respect to the Techeles. So probably you should have 7 different links, and on each link there's a Tosos that indicates that you should have at least 3. Ideally, if you can have 7 wrappings, that would be ideal. And according to the Rambam, you start off with, based on the Gemara, you start off with white, you end with white, and you have all Techeles in the middle. And maybe you start off with one whole link that should be white. So you should have at least 3 white strings in the middle, at the beginning, and 3 white strings at the end, and you could have Techeles in between, in the middle, so that's pretty easy to solve, but there are different, however you do it, it's basically going to be okay. The bottom line, okay, is that we should all want to strive to fulfill the mitzvah of Techeles. Obviously, one should follow their own Rebbeim and their poskim, and they should also strive to learn the sugyas on their own. And whether it teaches the need for a negative or a positive Mesorah, one thing that we do know from Sha'avicha v'yagecha zikinecha v'yamulach is that we should always turn to our Rebbeim for guidance. But in terms of respecting the legitimacy of those who are wearing this Techeles, I did check and show this morning. I saw one person wearing the Techeles, so there are people out there doing it. It's certainly something that can't be said to be without a basis. So for the time being, I would say nara upashte. We'll see how it all plays out. Every community should do as it deems appropriate in consultation with its rabbanim, its poskim. May we all be zocheh to fulfill this mitzvah b'hidua at the right time and in the best possible way.
Pinchas Steinberg were both Techeles, both Raziner and the were both.
Beautiful, beautiful.
He answered that.